This is part 2 of making my dream jacket using a remnant piece of fabric. In this video, I'm going to sew the jacket together. I will walk you through my preferred order of construction. It's my preferred method. Everybody does it differently, but this is what works for me. I think I made up my mind on the lining. We'll see how that goes. But I think I'm going to use a subtle print for the inside of the bodice, the top part of the jacket, and then I'll leave the plain black fabric for behind the flounce. We'll go ahead and cut the lining, and then I don't know if I'll have time in this video without making it extra long to sew the lining together, so that may be happening in the next video. So let's go ahead and get sewing. The first thing I like to do is take care of the darts. I like to work with the flat pieces of fabric to do the darts before I attach any of the other parts. It just makes it easier to manipulate the fabric. I use a perpendicular pen to mark the point of the dart just to make it easier to see where I'm going to stop stitching. As I'm pinning the dart, I look over to the other side to make sure that my chalk marks are lining up on both sides. So let's go ahead and finish pinning this dart. Now we're ready to sew. I like to backstitch at the very beginning of each dart, and I like to use a 3.5 stitch length for my darts. Now I'm going to take a moment here to zoom in. Notice how I stitch all the way off the fabric at the tip, and then I go back within the seam allowance and I backstitch there. I do that to prevent the tip from bubbling. Now I take it over to my ironing board and I use some steam and a dressmaker's ham and I press my dart. Now pressing is different from ironing. I don't just take a hot iron and just go back and forth on the seam. I like to use a little bit of steam because it makes it so much nicer. Alright, next is the back panels. And I like to pin everything in place. Some people like to just sew the pieces together without pins, but I'm a little OCD, so I really like to pin all of my pieces together before I stitch them. And I usually pin perpendicular so that I can just pull the pins out very easily. Alright, so here we go. We're going to stitch the back panels together. I'm going to start the seam with a back stitch and see how easy that is. Pulling out that pin nice and easy, keeping the edges even, and ending the seam with another back stitch. And now we do the other side. Now as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to show you what the final back panel is going to look like. And even though I only had a remnant piece of fabric to work with, I think the placement's pretty nice. So here I pressed my seams open nice and flat, and here's the finished product. Alright, let's stitch the front to the back panel. And as we do with everything else, we're going to pin everything in place. Satisfy that OCD. And we're going to stitch the side seams and the shoulder seams. Now this is a loosely woven fabric, so it tends to stretch a little bit. So quick little tip, you can use your snips or anything you have handy and just kind of align the fabric under the presser foot and get it all nice and even. Alright, so let's go ahead and stitch the other side. And if you want to see some pictures and some styling tips, head over to Instagram and follow me there at Sonera Design. Now, some of you may be wondering why I'm not serging these raw edges. And as you can see, the fabric does fray a little bit, but because I'm lining this garment and the seams are going to be just tucked away in there, I'm not really worried about it. And now this step is complete. Let's move on to attaching the lining to the flounce. Now, as you recall, I'm going to use the black lining for the flounce. I just didn't want it to fight against the beautiful print on the outside. To attach this, I'm going to lay both pieces right sides facing. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that entire curve right there on the outside. And I'm going to stitch along the entire curve. Now in this pattern, because of the curve, I decided to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the flounce. Most of the pattern has a 3/8 inch seam allowance, including the sleeves. But the less fabric you have on a curved seam like this, the better it will lay and the easier it is when you turn it inside out and press it. The next step is to edge stitch the lining. It's going to go right along this edge on the lining side with the seam allowances towards the lining. This is going to help prevent the lining to be seen from the outside of the garment. It's just going to make it lay nice and flat and beautiful. See? Now I've pressed the entire edge and you can see just a little bit of the outer fabric on the lining side. And you want that because now it gives it a nice clean finish. Alright, so now I need to stitch the waist curve of the lining and the outer fabric together just to hold it in place. It'll make it easier when I start stitching the flounce to the bodice. Okay, we had something that happened while I was recording this video. My phone ran out of storage and I thought that I had recorded the step where I attached the flounce to the actual bodice. And while I was editing this video, I realized that I'm missing that part. So I apologize for that. So I'll explain it as I go. So here I'm finishing up the stitching of the lining and the flounce material, just securing them together so that I can treat it as all one piece as I'm attaching that to the bodice. It just makes it a lot easier to handle. Okay, so here's the bodice. And now we're going to attach the bodice to the flounce. So I'll try to explain it to you as best as I can with a little bit of the clip that I have. I'm going to pin the flounce to the waistband of the bodice. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around the waist. Now once that's done, now we attach the zipper. So here we have a separating zipper. It's about 16 inches long. It's a little bit too long for the center front, but you can always cut that off and make it to what you need. Now, before we attach the zipper, we're going to interface the seam allowance of the center front on both sides, just to reinforce the fabric. Now, here are the strips of interfacing. They're about 5/8 of an inch wide in the length of my center front panel. Now, this is a fusible interfacing. So I'm going to iron it on and then pin my zipper to each side of the center front. And I mentioned earlier that the zipper is a little bit too long, so I'm going to just fold that over, catch that under the presser foot, and then I'm going to just stitch and then cut off the excess once I'm done. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit here. If you look at my presser foot, it's a very, very narrow presser foot. And I'm using that intentionally because I want to stitch right to the right side of the zipper teeth. I want it to be probably about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch away from the zipper feet, maybe slightly more. Because when you finish stitching that and you flip it to the to the outside, you're gonna see where the zipper extends just a little bit, and that helps to prevent the zipper to get stuck on the fabric. Now I'm at the point where the plastic piece at the bottom of the zipper, and so I sewed that using the hand wheel. I rotated the hand wheel slowly so I didn't break my needle. And then this is what I was explaining. See how the zipper extends just a little bit? Okay, my zipper is done. Let's go ahead and close it up and take a final look at it. And she is beautiful. See how you can see the teeth nice and clear, and it won't jam, it won't get stuck on the fabric because there's enough space between the teeth and the fabric edge. And the bottom is nice and even. Beautiful. Now we move on to the sleeves. Some people find set-in sleeves hard to work with, but with a little bit of practice, I think they're fine. So we're going to put a gathering stitch on the sleeve cap first. It's 2 rows of stitching, and I use a 4 to 5 stitch length, and I'm going to stitch between my notches. I start at my front notch, which is your single notch, and then I stitch along the sleeve cap to the back notches, which is the double notch. I like to use 2 rows of stitching because it's easier to pull the thread and gather it nice and even. So that's what I'm doing here. I like to put my first row of stitching at the seam allowance, which in this case is about 3/8 of an inch, and then I put my second row between that row of stitching and the raw edge. Now to finish off the sleeve, we're going to stitch the seam of the sleeve, pinning those raw edges nice and even, just to make it easier once you take it over to the sewing machine. And I just realized that I put my tripod a little too close to my sewing machine, so I apologize for the trembling. And my sleeves are done. All right, so I took my seam and I pressed it nice and open. Everything's nice and flat. I'm ready to go. So I'm going to attach the sleeves to the bodice. So I'm going to turn them inside out because I want to be able to pin the sleeve to the bodice with the right sides facing each other. Now I think this is where people get a little stuck because they're taking this enclosed curve and they're attaching this to an enclosed armhole. So you have 2 curves that are trying to fit together while inserting the sleeve inside the garment. So here's the sleeve, right sides together with the bodice, and I'm going to pin it all the way around. I've already pinned the sleeve seam to the underarm seam, and that matches. Now I'm going to take the notch that's on the top of my sleeve cap and I'm going to match it to my shoulder seam. I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. Now I'm going to take my notches. These are, I believe, my front notches, and I'm going to match those and then pin between the notch and the underarm seam. And here's my thread for my gathering. All right, so I'm going to move over to the back and I'm going to match my back notches and I'm going to pin that in place. Notice that I haven't pinned any of the area on the sleeve cap where I have my gathering stitches, because now I'm going to gather that to fit my armhole. Now you're going to see where the sleeve is bigger or has more fabric than my armhole. So now I'm going to take my threads, and sometimes if you grab the bobbin thread, that pulls a little bit easier, but either one, as long as you're using a basting stitch, will work. You're going to hold your stitches in your fabric, and you're just going to pull on the thread, and with your fingernail just pull the fabric so that you can gather it little by little and keep those gathers nice and even. And you're going to do that until you notice that the sleeve now fits that portion of the armhole, and you're going to pin that in place. Once you do this a few times, set-in sleeves are not that scary. All right, once that side is done, let's move on to the other side. Again, it's a little too big for my armhole, so I'm going to grab my gathering threads and I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to pull on both threads at the same time, only from one side, okay? And I'm going to start pulling on that, gathering that nice and even until the sleeve and the armhole are the same length. And if you feel like you need to, I would put a little bit of steam on those gathers just so that you can flatten out a little bit of the gathers just to shrink that sleeve into your armhole. You don't want to end up with puckers on your sleeve. And now we stitch all the way around. And make sure you do that to the other side so that you can install your other sleeve. All right, let's get this stitched. And again, I'm using 3/8 of an inch for my seam allowance. Most people like to use 5/8 of an inch and then they trim it down. That's probably a good idea if you want to keep your seam allowances the same all around your pattern. But once you get used to certain seam allowances in certain areas, it's better to have less seam allowance on a curve like that. So now we push everything to the outside and we take a look at the sleeve. And there is my set-in sleeve. She looks beautiful. I love it. Nice and smooth. Okay, my friends, the jacket is done. At least the outer part is complete. I think I have enough for this video. I don't want to make it too long. So I think I'm going to stop for today. I will cut out the lining tomorrow along with the facings and put that together and then attach it to the jacket itself. But I love the way the print placement is everywhere in the jacket. The back came out beautiful. I hope you can see the bottom of this flounce. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So I'm really happy with it. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.